The lights inside the arena never fully dimmed, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. SmackDown was supposed to flow, to move, to keep the audience buoyant between segments. But the air that night felt stalled, like the building was holding its breath without knowing why. Commentary spoke in practiced tones, filling space, selling anticipation that wasn't actually there. The crowd murmured instead of roared. Camera shots lingered longer than usual on faces that looked uncertain rather than excited. Nothing had happened yet, and already something felt off. When the production truck cut to the ring, there was no music cue waiting. No graphics teased what was next. The ring announcer stood inside the ropes with a microphone held too close to his chest. Eyes darting toward the stage, waiting for instructions that seemed delayed. The commentary hesitated, voices lowering, trying to interpret silence in real time. One of them joked nervously about technical issues. Another didn't respond. The joke hung there, unclaimed. Then a single, unbranded spotlight turned on near the entrance ramp. Not dramatic, not centered. Slightly crooked as if someone rushed the cue. The crowd reaction shifted, not into cheers but into questions. Phones came up slowly. People leaned forward instead of standing. Commentary stopped joking. One voice asked quietly if this was supposed to be happening. No one answered him. Footsteps echoed before the camera even found the figure. Heavy, deliberate steps, unaccompanied by music, amplified by the arena's acoustics. When the camera finally cut, it didn't zoom. It didn't dramatize. It simply showed a person walking out who was not advertised, not expected, and not welcomed cleanly. The reaction wasn't loud. It fractured. Some gasps, some boos that died halfway through, some claps that sounded apologetic. Silence swallowed the rest. The figure paused at the top of the ramp, not acknowledging the crowd, not playing to it. They looked older than memory allowed, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the ring as if it were a courtroom instead of a stage. Commentary stumbled over the name, unsure whether to say it at all. One voice whispered it anyway, more question than announcement. The other commentators fell quiet, like they didn't want to be responsible for what came next. As the walk continued, the crowd divided further. You could see it physically. Arms crossed, people sitting back down, few fans shouting things that weren't chants, just raw words thrown into the air. The ring announcer exited quickly, leaving the ring empty, as if instinct told him not to be there. When the figure stepped between the ropes, the camera caught a moment of hesitation, a hand gripping the top rope too tightly. No pyro followed, no pose. Just a person standing in the center of the ring while the arena tried to decide how it felt. Commentary finally spoke again, voices lower, slower, acknowledging that the mood had shifted without permission. Whatever SmackDown had been before this moment was gone. Something heavier had replaced it, and no one yet understood why. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, and the camera refused to cut away from it. The figure stood in the ring, breathing visible in the rise and fall of their chest, eyes scanning the crowd without recognition. This wasn't a return framed for applause. It felt like an interruption. Commentary tried to regain control, offering cautious language, emphasizing surprise, emphasizing uncertainty. One voice admitted they hadn't been told this was happening. Another suggested there might be an explanation coming. None sounded convinced. A microphone lay on the mat near the figure's boots, clearly placed there ahead of time, which only deepened the confusion. Someone had planned this, even if no one seemed ready for it. The figure bent slowly, picking it up, and the sound of feedback squealed briefly through the speakers, sharp enough to make people wince. The crowd reacted to that noise more than to the person holding the mic. When the figure finally spoke, the voice was rougher than memory suggested, quieter too. They didn't open with a greeting. No hometown mention, no acknowledgement of time away. Just a statement that landed wrong in the room. Something about needing to be here tonight. Something about unfinished weight. Commentary stopped completely. The camera cut to faces in the crowd. Confused, wary, a few visibly angry. The words that followed weren't a promo in the usual sense. They weren't selling a match or building a rivalry. They sounded like confession filtered through restraint. The figure spoke about watching from afar, about trying to move on, about realizing that distance hadn't softened anything. They didn't name names. They didn't assign blame directly. That restraint made it worse. The audience filled the gaps themselves, and those gaps were sharp. Boos rose then, not unified, but layered over pockets of applause that felt defensive rather than celebratory. Commentary returned carefully, acknowledging the division, remarking on how rare it was to feel the building split so cleanly. One commentator questioned whether this was the right place for this conversation. Another said, maybe there was never a right place. The figure's hands shook slightly as they gripped the microphone. The camera didn't hide it. They admitted to mistakes without detailing them, two consequences that followed them home. At the mention of family, the crowd quieted again, unsure whether reacting at all would be disrespectful. This wasn't entertainment in the way wrestling usually was. It felt like watching someone reopen something they'd stitched shut badly. Backstage, though unseen, the tension was implied through commentary cues. One voice mentioned executives watching closely, another hinted at talent reactions behind the curtain. The idea that this moment wasn't isolated began to sink in. This wasn't just about the person in the ring. It was about everyone who now had to respond to them. When the figure finally stopped talking, they didn't wait for a reaction. They dropped the microphone deliberately, the sound echoing louder than expected. The crowd didn't erupt. It didn't even boo consistently. It just existed in a state of discomfort. Commentary summed it up in a sentence that sounded more like a warning than analysis. SmackDown hadn't just been interrupted. It had been confronted, and no one was sure what that meant yet. The camera cut away too late, lingering on the ring as the figure exited without ceremony, walking back up the ramp with the same heavy steps they'd entered with. There was no music to soften the moment, no graphic to signal closure. The crowd watched them leave in uneasy quiet, some shouting, some silent, most unsure how to feel. Commentary filled the void with speculation, voices overlapping briefly before settling into careful, measured tones. They acknowledged the shock without endorsing it, described the moment without framing it as positive or negative. Backstage, the effects were immediate. The camera didn't show it, but commentary hinted at it through language. Words like stunned, tense, and unsettled crept into the broadcast. One commentator mentioned seeing talent peering from behind curtains, reactions ranging from disbelief to visible frustration. Another noted that some locker room leaders were already making phone calls. Whatever had just happened was not staying confined to the ring. Social media graphics flashed on screen, unusually fast, showcasing polarized reactions in real time. Some messages welcomed the return with guarded hope. Others condemned it outright, questioning the decision to give this person a platform. The commentary read them without commentary, letting the words speak for themselves. The division wasn't manufactured. It was raw, and it was spreading. Later in the show, references kept slipping in, unplanned but unavoidable. A scheduled match felt flatter, the crowd distracted, still processing. Commentary struggled to pivot back to normal storytelling, occasionally pausing mid-sentence as if remembering where they were. One commentator admitted this was the kind of moment that changes a room instantly. It's not because it excites people, but because it forces them to reckon with something unresolved. Reports began filtering in through commentary about internal meetings happening as the show continued. Executives, agents, legal teams. The language stayed vague, but the implication was clear. This wasn't just a creative decision. It carried risk. It reopened conversations some believed were closed. The locker room, according to commentary, was split, much like the crowd. Some saw opportunity for redemption narratives. Others saw damage being done again. The figure themselves was mentioned sparingly, their absence now louder than their presence had been. Commentary speculated about their mindset, careful not to justify or condemn. They spoke about pressure, about returning to a space that doesn't forget Isley. The psychological weight of stepping back into that ring was acknowledged without romanticizing it. As the show approached its final segment, the earlier moments still hung over everything. The crowd's energy never fully recovered. Applause felt tentative. Booing felt tired. When SmackDown finally went off the air, commentary closed not with a tease for next week, but with reflection. They admitted the night hadn't gone as planned. They acknowledged that some moments aren't meant to be comfortable. Then they signed off, leaving viewers with unresolved tension instead of answers. The fallout began before the camera stopped rolling, and it only intensified once the broadcast ended. Backstage reports described conversations held in hushed tones, doors closed more often than usual. Wrestlers who had already showered stayed longer, lingering in hallways, replaying the segment on phones. Some were angry that the moment hadn't been discussed with them. Others were shaken, forced to confront feelings they hadn't planned on revisiting. Media outlets moved fast, framing the segment as controversial within minutes. Headlines questioned intent, timing, and responsibility. Commentary teams from other shows weighed in cautiously, aware that whatever stance they took would be scrutinized. The company released a brief statement that said little, confirming only that the segment was intentional. That confirmation deepened the debate rather than settling it. The returning figure reportedly left the building quickly, escorted through a different exit. Sources spoke about their demeanor being withdrawn, not triumphant. Family members were mentioned in coverage not by name but as part of the broader consequence. The decision to return had personal weight beyond storyline, and that reality pressed in from all sides. Within the locker room, leaders called for meetings. Some talent expressed concern about the message being sent. Others argued that wrestling has always been a place for uncomfortable truths. The disagreement wasn't loud, but it was firm. Lines were drawn quietly. Trust was tested subtly. No one pretended this was just another angle. Fans continued to argue long into the night. Some felt the segment was necessary, forcing accountability through visibility. Others felt it was harmful, reopening wounds without offering resolution. The company didn't step in to guide the conversation. Silence from official channels became its own statement, leaving interpretation to the audience. The psychological impact on the returning figure became a focal point. Commentary and later discussions speculated about the toll of standing in front of a divided crowd, of hearing silence where cheers used to be. The idea of redemption was mentioned less often now, replaced by questions about whether redemption was even the goal. Internally, the segment changed how future plans were discussed. Creative meetings reportedly slowed, weighed down by the need to consider repercussions beyond ratings. The moment had altered priorities, if only temporarily. It reminded everyone that wrestling's power lies not just in spectacle, but in its ability to mirror real discomfort. By the next morning, the shock had settled into something heavier. This wasn't excitement or outrage anymore. It was contemplation. The segment had done what it did without offering closure, and that absence lingered. It had forced a reckoning that wouldn't fade quickly, leaving everyone involved to carry a piece of it forward. Days later, the segment was still being dissected, slowed down frame by frame, words analyzed for hidden meaning, yet clarity never fully emerged. The company maintained its distance, allowing the moment to exist without explanation. That choice frustrated many, but it also reinforced the gravity of what had happened. This wasn't meant to be wrapped up neatly. The returning figure remained absent from television, their silence louder now than any promo could have been. Commentary referenced them sparingly, careful not to reignite the divide too aggressively. Each mention carried weight, a reminder that unresolved things don't disappear just because attention shifts. In the locker room, relationships adjusted subtly. Some wrestlers avoided the topic altogether. Others used it as a catalyst for private conversations about accountability, forgiveness, and boundaries, and no consensus formed. And maybe that was the point. The segment hadn't been designed to unify. It had exposed fractures that were already there. Fans eventually moved on to other storylines, other controversies, but the question lingered beneath the surface. Was this moment necessary, or was it harmful? Did it open a path forward, or did it reopen something that should have stayed closed? The lack of answers ensured the debate stayed alive, quieter but persistent. The figure's legacy now felt heavier, reshaped by a single uncomfortable appearance. Not redeemed. Destroyed. Altered. Commentary and retrospective discussions framed it as a turning point. Not in storyline terms, but in how wrestling handles real consequence. The segment had reminded everyone that some returns aren't about cheers, but about confrontation. As time passed, the arena returned to its usual rhythms. Lights dimmed properly. Music hit on cue. Crowds reacted on instinct again. Yet those who were there that night remembered the silence, the hesitation, the way the mood shifted without warning. It became a reference point, a moment whispered about rather than celebrated. In the end, that SmackDown segment didn't provide answers. It didn't heal wounds or settle debates. simply forced everyone watching to sit with discomfort longer than they wanted to. And maybe that was the most honest thing it could have done, leaving behind a question that still hasn't found peace.